Speaker, to borrow again. Such bad example from leaders and speeches have inspired many young people to be misled. I celebrate the fact, Mr. Speaker, that I have seen further down the President's speech that an amnesty is being extended to many of these young people. And we have been cited examples of people from across the country, from the coast to northeastern, to the western part of the country, Mr. Speaker. People who have borrowed in excess of 1,000 times and saved many times and are able now to transact and do business, Mr. Speaker, courtesy of this revolutionary product, Mr. Speaker. I wish, Mr. Speaker, to urge and insist on the President, Mr. Speaker, to continue investing in that particular product and even double the amount which ordinary citizens can borrow, Mr. Speaker. I am aware, Mr. Speaker, because I represent the government side in this House, Mr. Speaker, that on the 30th of this month, such a product is going to be launched. And to the ordinary people that are continuing to borrow and are partaking of this particular product, Mr. Speaker, their life is increasingly getting better. Mr. Speaker, at a default rate of 73% for a GOK product, that is extremely successful. People need to compare what are the default rates, Mr. Speaker, of other government and economic stimulus programs that have been run before. People used to take money and disappear. But at least on this particular product, Mr. Speaker, at 73%, and I know it's going to increase and it will get better, because there are people who disappeared with 500, Mr. Speaker, but at the end of this month, when they see what is going to happen to those that have been diligent, those have borrowed and repaid and borrowed and repaid, many of them are going to be diligent enough and return to this particular product, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of our campaign promises which the President spoke very prominently about in this particular speech is a fertilizer subsidy program, Mr. Speaker. That because of that specific intervention, we have added more than 200,000 bags of maize, Mr. Speaker, into the economy. That's why, and it is an irrefutable fact, Mr. Speaker, that today, if you walk into any supermarket in this country, you will buy a packet of unga for anywhere between 145 to 180 Kenya shillings. You know very well, Mr. Speaker, that the obtaining price at the time this administration came into office, Mr. Speaker, was in excess of 200 Kenya shillings. That is what we are speaking about, the ability to bring down the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, that ordinary citizens are able to see, Mr. Speaker, that because of us subsidizing production, as opposed to the lopsided economies that was being run by the cartels who were in charge previously, Mr. Speaker, where you're subsidizing consumption, only benefiting the millers and the big boys of this town who are running big corporations and big farms, Mr. Speaker. The person that we have subsidized and made sure that they are able to produce cheaply and competitively is the farmer of the Republic of Kenya. If you grow across this republic, from every corner, Mr. Speaker, they have been recipient of this particular program. And I am aware, Mr. Speaker, that even as we go into this financial year, that program shall be made better. Mr. Speaker, part of the reason why I celebrate this particular program, Mr. Speaker, is that I know that before the coming into place of this particular administration, previous administration had tried to register the farmers of this country, Mr. Speaker. And they were being given bills of running into billions of shillings, that this is the amount that is going to take to register farmers, find out the size of land that they have in this particular republic. But courtesy of the ingenuity of this administration, Mr. Speaker, using the provincial administration and asking our chiefs and ACCs to go out to the farmlands and register our farmers, this project was done, Mr. Speaker, at near zero expenses to the GOK. And more than 5 million farmers of this country, Mr. Speaker, have been registered. We are now able to tell, Mr. Speaker, what is the size of land under their cultivation, what they are cultivating, how much fertilizer they need, Mr. Speaker. Making policy decision that is driven by data is a key to the successful implementation of any manifesto, Mr. Speaker. And I laud the President for leading that particular effort, Mr. Speaker, because I know with such interventions, Mr. Speaker, the farmers of Kenya can only get better. It is my hope and aspiration, Mr. Speaker, that this program shall be extended to all the crops and not just maize farmers that are doing this under the subsistence farming, Mr. Speaker. I believe that as they model this particular program, they'll make it in a better way, that it shall be crop specific, so that tea farmers are able to benefit enormously from this program, sugarcane farmers, Mr. Speaker, coffee farmers, Mr. Speaker, and so on and so forth. Mr. Speaker, of course, I know for a fact, and this is something that we need to check as a House, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that our farmers access this subsidy fertilizer at the nearest point, Mr. Speaker. I know, because this was the initial test run, Mr. Speaker, many of them had to travel long distances to go and pick a bag or two of fertilizer, Mr. Speaker. It is my hope, Mr. Speaker, that the Ministry of Agriculture can team up with our agrovets, at least in every village, Mr. Speaker, that I know in this republic that has a farming population. There is an agrovet. And in these agrovets, Mr. Speaker, they can link up together with our Ministry of Agriculture so that a farmer walks to the center closest to their home and picks up this subsidized fertilizer, go and till their land and produce cheaply, Mr. Speaker. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we know for a fact that despite the fact that the government has worked extremely hard to bring down the cost of inflation from a high of 9.8 last September to now downwards of 6, and it can even get better, Mr. Speaker, as we continue to produce and tap in onto the long rain seasons that we are having, Mr. Speaker. There is need to invest further in post-harvest handling, Mr. Speaker, because we know many of our farmers continue to lose almost 20 to 30% of their products, Mr. Speaker, because of post-harvest losses, Mr. Speaker. It is my sincere hope that with the assurance that was given by the head of state in his presidential speech, that this is being addressed, and he alluded to the fact that on the day that he was speaking before Parliament, the first batch of large-scale and small-scale dryers for maize farmers, Mr. Speaker, and wheat and rice, Mr. Speaker, was docking in the port of Mombasa, Mr. Speaker, that the same can be cleared quickly and get into the farms and help our farmers so that they do not lose even a single bag of the crop that they have produced and sent to us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know the President is speaking to the values and the aspirations and the challenges that we continue to have as a country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, corruption is a challenge that we continue to face, Mr. Speaker. And the question that we must ask ourselves is, we have set up EACC for almost 10 or even more years, thanks to the new constitution, Mr. Speaker. But 2 administrations down the line, this being the 3rd, we continue to see an increase, Mr. Speaker, in corrupt practices in our public offices, in private sector, Mr. Speaker. We must begin to ask very difficult questions of ourselves as the people of Kenya. Whether is the issue just about the institutions that because many times if you listen to Kenyans, they want to tell you EACC needs to do this, DCI should do the other, but without addressing this particular challenge of corruption from a values problem. Mr. Speaker, we must begin to teach our children right from school, and even to us that are in leadership, Mr. Speaker, about the values that we expose, the values that we expect to see in other people, Mr. Speaker, whether the same can be replicated. Mr. Speaker, I see members do, even us here in Parliament, there are many things that members do ignorantly, and they think that perhaps that is not an act of corruption. But if checked under the prism of values, Mr. Speaker, Chapter 10 of our Constitution, you are actually not living up to the expectation of this Constitution. How many times, Mr. Speaker, for example, do you see members, particularly on Wednesday morning, Mr. Speaker, and I don't want to say which side of the House is fond of doing this, walk in, sign, and leave without making any contribution or even sitting to listen to the proceedings of the House, so that the House just captures and records that you are part and parcel. You are cheating the system, Mr. Speaker, but is that a reflection of the values that have been exposed under Article 10, Mr. Speaker? You ought to do better as a leader, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Eddie, what's your point of order?
Mr. Speaker, your chair had ruled on 101, Mr. Speaker, on parliamentary language here. And a member of the minority side was gagged for using the term, President is lying and the members of the majority are lying. What is so different in the using the word lying and throwing aspersion on the members of parliament and saying they're cheating, Mr. Speaker? Is the majority leader in order to throw these aspersions and further use non-parliamentary language by indicating that there are members of this House who are cheating the system, Mr. Speaker. Is it in order?
Majority Leader, I want to urge you to restrain yourself from the language and use the parliamentary language.
You need to listen to what I said. I didn't say members are cheating. Cheating the system is completely different from you lying or cheating. Mr. Speaker, cheating the system is when a gadget or a particular system get the impression that you have done something which you haven't. When you log into this system, it assumes that you have sat through the sittings and you'll be marked as having been present. That is what is called in simple English, Senator Eddie, cheating a system. It's not the same with cheating. It's basic English, Mr. Speaker.
Majority Leader, proceed.
Yes.
And restrain yourself on the language that you're using. Make sure you...
No, what I need to restrain myself is a kind of English that I use, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it will find better favor, Mr. Speaker, if I spoke in a simple language which everybody will appreciate and say that I haven't misled or insulted anybody, Mr. Speaker, because it is my plain understanding. Rarely do I lose my cool or speak things ill of others. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I was gracious enough not to mention who normally does these kind of things, yet the whole House knows, Mr. Speaker. So allow me to perhaps proceed, Mr. Speaker, without having to respond to... Mr. Speaker, you need to protect me from Senator Eddie, because otherwise I'll easily be distracted. Mr. Speaker, I will continue to speak on a very important topic that the President touched, about the transformation that is happening in our economy. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that cannot be disputed that our debt to GDP ratio is at an all-time high. That as we speak today, at 71% debt exposure, it simply means, Mr. Speaker, that for every 100 shillings that you are collecting, only 29 is left for counties to pay salaries, to do development. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that not even a magician can work any miracle when you are handed over such an economy. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what has the president, what has this administration done? And I agree with him when he reports that this country is on a path of transformation, because the first and the simple basic thing that he has done is to reduce on our fiscal deficit from an upwards of 8 to 9% to 5.4 in this current financial year, Mr. Speaker. And I know for a fact, Mr. Speaker, that there is even a further supplementary budget, which our colleagues in the other House are likely to debate tomorrow, that is lowering that fiscal deficit, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that, one, we live within our means. That, two, Mr. Speaker, we are responsible in our borrowing. That, three, and most importantly, we tell Kenyans the truth, that for a long time, Mr. Speaker, we have lived a lie. Mr. Speaker, we are behaving like university or college students that I used to see in our university days, Mr. Speaker, where when they get help money, they want to buy all the flashiest of clothes, they want to buy the nicest of shoes, Mr. Speaker. Then eventually when they arrive at the university, they cannot even afford food, and they are left begging, Mr. Speaker. That is a kind of economy that we have been running for so many years. That's why, Mr. Speaker, when we say that we must tighten our belt, that we must teach our people that you cannot enjoy better services, Mr. Speaker, without having to pay a share of it, it is the truth and nothing can be done about it, Mr. Speaker. I know people, Mr. Speaker, want to play popular, want to play populist politics, Mr. Speaker, on this particular issue of taxation. But we have to be realistic and tell ourselves what are the options that are left with us as a country. Default is not an option. There is no responsible administration that is going to default on its debts, Mr. Speaker, and look straight into the eye of its citizens and say, because we did not want to make you feel the burden, allow us to default, Mr. Speaker. We know what has happened to countries that have defaulted, Mr. Speaker. Things will get even worse. But the president is simply telling the country that let me be a responsible father and tell you the hard facts that between you as the adult population today in the Republic of Kenya and the future generations, that is our children, our young people that are in schools, feeling the pain of a country that has been ravaged by